Conversations with Uli Baer on big ideas and great books. Welcome to Think About It. I'm very excited to be sitting here in New York City in person with Paul Edwards. So first of all, Paul, thank you for making time.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
So Paul is an assistant professor at NYU, where I also teach, who is just starting at the end of this term in English and dramatic literature, you said, right?
Yeah.
And your area is, I guess, in large terms, broad terms, sort of early modernity, 20th century. And the work that I know, which you've done, is kind of the way the Harlem Renaissance shapes, impacts, influences, does something in its broader European context, right?
Yep, right. Yeah, it's effects in Germany in the 20s and 30s, sort of across the political bounds of liberal democracy as well as within fascism.
And you have written on, and the forthcoming book, as I see, is called The Black Wave, the New Negro Renaissance in Interwar Germany, which is about especially appearance of performers, musicians, artists, actors, etc., on German stages who come from the African-American larger context, right?
That's right. So the ways in which they brought what we would call Black modernity to German stages and to film, and the ways that Germans had to reconcile their conceptions of African primitivism with American cosmopolitanism.
Then we're right with our topic. So today I asked Paul to come here to talk about Toni Morrison, the novelist, writer, author, as a critic. And the book that I wanted to talk to you about, because it's just a book that's been really influential for me. It's been influential, I think, in literary studies, but maybe not quite in the way that I would have expected. That she gave as a set of lectures in, I think, 1991 called Playing in the Dark, Whiteness and the Literary Imagination. And this book, I remember, but I am not totally sure whether I'm mythologizing my own past. I think she gave these lectures at Harvard University.
That's right, yeah.
And I think I attended them, and I had really not much of an idea what was happening. Toni Morrison was Toni Morrison, but she wasn't a superstar. She was a very, very well-recognized, famous writer. And I just remember being in the room and thinking, something is happening, something is shifting, but I couldn't quite put my head in it. But so, in any case, I've been reading this book for now, whatever it is, 30 years.
30 years, yeah.
And maybe we can start there. What is Morrison setting out to do? And she's, at this time, a professor at Princeton. She's a very accomplished writer. She's been an editor. She's had many jobs. And she's sort of trying to say we have missed a major part of American literary history.
That's right. I think one way we could sort of look at what she's doing in Playing in the Dark as a lecture series as well as in a book is to really instead of, I think, what we often think of in the academy as sort of making space for unheard voices, what she's saying is actually there have been voices that have been represented and reproduced across the American canon. And it is of interest to us the fact that these voices have not been recognized as being operated and used within sort of white authorship. So the ways in which Hemingway or Edgar Allan Poe, and she's got really interesting examples in Willa Cather, that these are authors who we often sort of view in the canon, view the ways in which that they are thinking about America or Americana, and at the same time they are clearly dealing with, and as the title of the book says, like playing with concepts of blackness.
So first, the book is not a kind of effort to resurrect sort of overlooked or forgotten texts. This is not a book on sort of lost treasures in the canon written by African-American writers. It's actually, as you said, it's looking at canonical American writers. I think they were canonical for at least 100 years, whether they're canonical today. So Faulkner, Hemingway, Poe, and Cather are really her main references in a way?
Yeah, they're her main references. I think there's also, understandably, a lot to do with figures like Mark Twain. And what we see her doing is, I think maybe to sort of reset, I think a lot of the ways that we see people engaging with Toni Morrison are the ways that she makes sort of Black voices really evident. That from Sula, Bluest Eye, Tar Baby, and especially Beloved, which is around the corner from Playing in the Dark, that she's trying to recapture the possibilities of Black representation, Black identity sort of within American spaces. But I think at the same time, Playing in the Dark is really exposing that, she's not the first author to think about Blackness. And obviously, as a Black woman, she's adding so much more. But the fact that a lot of these authors are, in fact, fixated and thinking about Blackness and are fully aware of the Black presence in the United States, but also the fact that these authors often have some form of a crutch, that they are sort of leaning on Blackness in a really fascinating and at sometimes absolutely terrifying way to sort of think about their own positionality. Well, what does Blackness do to whiteness? And so there's something in these, incredibly short lectures that I think is really revelatory in how we think about white authorship. And I think sort of the big question of often of Black authors, of Black intellectuals, like, why are you always making it about race? And I think that Morrison sort of turns that around and says, well, we weren't the first people to really make it about race. It's actually sort of evident and quite large within sort of a white American canon.
Let me ask you one thing about what you just said. As a Black woman writer, she says two things that are just maybe for our listeners are kind of interesting. She says, I will be accused of kind of having an agenda. And she said, I will let this accusation stand.
Yes.
However, the evidence of this short book, it's a very short book, is race and racialized characters, and especially Black imagined figures, are all over American literature in this project of self-invention. So she says, it's not my thing that I sussed out these things in these texts. It's there, it's present. And then the second thing she says, and it's been systematically, studiously either overlooked or kind of rendered insignificant. And the project, which there's a couple projects she's describing. One project is this invention of American identity as kind of uncharted territory, a new person, this Emerson idea. We don't have a history. We're inventing our own history. We're giving ourselves our identity. And she said, this project needs something else to prop it up.
Right. Yes.
And the first accusation, just to stay with this for a moment, because in our contemporary moment, 2022, there are lots of charges around this, like sort of people come with their agenda, their identity shapes their scholarship. And I like the way she just says, I may be accused of this. I'll let the accusation stand.
Yes. No, I mean, I think it sort of is a beautiful statement to say, yes, I have an agenda. And I think that, as you pointed to, that addendum is key, which is that, but it's really there. It's sort of the just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not, they're not after you. I know I just messed that up, but
no, but you're right.
Yeah, I mean, like, there's something about that sort of element that I think is not everyone gets to say that, and not everyone gets to follow. Not everyone is able to follow through on that sort of statement.
And following through is sort of like, to give sort of our listeners a sense of this book. The tone of this book is really interesting to me. It's kind of, it's never apologetic for what it's doing.
Right.
It's never defensive. It keeps on saying, and I think this is really a major claim she's making, I can enrich our understanding of how literature contributes to this project of American identity. She said, I don't diminish it. I'm not criticizing. I'm not saying these people have a problem, although they have a problem. But the problem is really interesting, rather than, oh my God, racist caricatures in these texts. This is bad. She says, and this is what she says in the beginning of the book also, I'm not writing as a critic as much, but as a novelist. I'm saying, what do these things do in these books?
Yeah, and I think the fact that she positions herself, not only as a Black woman, but as an author, and that what she's doing is thinking through authorship. She's thinking through, what does it mean to sort of write characters? What does it mean to sort of have characters do specific things? She's able to, at once, I think, use her lectures to do actual literary criticism, but to think about what is it that I think she almost explicitly says, this is about what authors do. And I'm thinking about how characters and ideas sort of operate within text, but as an author, not as a critic. That being said, I think there's some really powerful and potent ways in which, that can't help but be literary criticism. And it can't help, in some respects, also to almost be something like performance studies. Whenever I read Playing in the Dark, I think back to also Eric Lott's Love and Theft, and to think about that part of what Eric Lott writes about are the ways...
So what is this? To give us the reference here?
Yeah. So Eric Lott is an academic. His first major book is on blackface in the 19th century. And the title of his book, Love and Theft, is about the idea of sort of black culture is... loved, but it's also stolen. It is something that is appreciated in certain context, and blackface is about the appropriation, but also the sort of appreciation of black culture. And of course, it's an incredibly complex argument that is not simply, the platonic ideal of love. But I see that Toni Morrison is also engaged in sort of the ways in which authorship is going to use the tools that are available, and it's going to show a certain type of appreciation for what these different identities and different concepts can do. And so that can be a mix of the sort of racist, incredibly terrifying caricature of blackness, but it can also be sort of this interesting stand-in where the figure actually, for all intents and purposes, isn't really black, but blackness is going to be used as a counterpoint to whiteness. And again, at times terrifying, at times deeply troubling, but I think she sees that there's something useful and powerful as authors wield these concepts.
And terrifying maybe what... in the Willa Cather story. So this is called
Sapphira and the Slave Girl.
Sapphira and the Slave Girl, a late novel that she basically says critics mostly dismiss and say Willa Cather kind of not so great anymore.
Yeah.
And you're thinking it's published in the 40s, I think?
It's her last novel, yeah.
1940s?
Yeah, it's 1941.
And you're thinking this is a book about a white woman who somehow wants to show up her husband's affection and love and basically wants to destroy this opportunity for him to rape an enslaved girl.
Well, so it is partially that, and it is an interesting story. And I think the first thing to sort of point to is that the story is called Sapphira and the Slave Girl, and so Sapphira is this woman with dropsy. She is mostly confined to bed and a wheelchair, and Morrison points to the fact that the slave girl, whose name is Nancy, is immediately sort of dropped in the title as not important, right? So the novel should be called Sapphira and Nancy, but instead it is, proper name and subject position. And Morrison looks to the ways that the character of Nancy, the slave girl, is moved around in a way that really denies not only the personhood of the enslaved. I mean, for a novel of the 1940s, this is 80 years after the Civil War. It marks the ways in which not only Nancy, but Nancy's family isn't real. One of the things Morrison talks about is that Nancy's mother does not act like a black mother. And it's not simply like there are obviously multiple ways in which one could be a black mother, but that there is a real disregard for how Nancy's mother is able to even comprehend Nancy. And there's a real separation of womanhood between the two of them, especially as it comes to the concept of sexual violence, that Nancy's mother doesn't seem to care, doesn't even notice. Nancy can't talk to her about it, and it goes beyond simply the sort of social death elements of American slavery, but really sort of posits that there is no relationship between a black mother and her daughter.
And there Morrison does two things. She says, okay, we could think, okay, this is Willa Cather just reproducing a stereotype, but she's saying here she runs into a problem as a novelist. We don't quite believe something. And in a way, she just says, well, even if you're creating a caricature, it sort of has to function in a way. And so something in the narrative doesn't quite work. And I found that so really fascinating about this project, that she keeps on saying here, the novelist, Hemingway, Faulkner, Twain, whatever, they run into problems. And for me, there was always a sense Morrison is taking these people incredibly seriously, and she's not just saying these are white authors who basically have some problem with race or they have some racism in them anyway. That's not her project at all. She's just saying it doesn't really work as a novel.
Yes, right.
And it could work in a strange way. That something could work, but what can't they allow to happen? And there she switches kind of, in my view, from a critic to a novelist, saying this is not how a novel doesn't work this way.
Right, yeah. I mean, I think, to the point of Toni Morrison as, I guess, not only as an author, but as a teacher of creative writing, that, if Willa Cather or anyone else was to sit in her classroom, it's like, how could you have a story that seems to give some personhood to these Black women, but can't make that leap of carrying Black mother to Black child is a real problem of the novel, as you said. And of course, the thing that also happens in this text is that Willa Cather appears at the end of it. She is a character within her own novel, and that the care and concern of the Black characters are toward Willa Cather as a character. And so instead of a moment of reunion between Black mother and Black child, because the Black child runs away near the end of the text, it is about the sort of reunification of the slave family. The fact that you can have the enslaved individuals return to the enslaver family, and that it's that reunification. It is this sort of odd, really late version of sort of the lost cause myth sort of imagined into this text.
And that myth is sort of that. So this young girl runs away to Canada and then years later comes back.
Yes, yeah.
And then she sort of makes up or something.
Right, yeah. I mean, the text sort of doesn't explicitly say this, but it's almost as if the Black family needs to apologize to the white family. Even as Saphira's own daughter is involved in the abolitionist cause, helps Nancy run away, that what needs to happen is, in some respects, that Saphira needs to die so that these white characters can actually reunify. So there's this sort of interesting generational element to the text as well, that the mother dies, the father dies, the rapist brother-uncle figure dies in the Civil War, in oddly heroic terms. And so the remaining characters are sort of left to pick up the pieces in sort of the Reconstruction era in a way that, again, is really reconciling more whiteness than it is towards reconciling or avenging the issues of enslavement for Black individuals.
And this novel, so I'd never heard of this novel until I read Morrison's text. So I'd read my Antonia, and then I read Pioneers, I think. And my Antonia was for me like a revelatory sort of the Midwest as a site, although Willa Cather lived in the village in New York City. Sort of an amazing story, and then a couple short stories. If you think about that novel, is that a novel that's readable today? Because I think Morrison's project is really to never go in this direction of saying we shouldn't read these books. This is just some racist fantasy, or this is absurd, or it doesn't work out. She said it doesn't work out, but the not working out, she links that consistently in this book to say something in the American project doesn't work out and keeps on being covered over.
Right. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think one of the things that's really helpful, and like you, I did not read Saphira and the Slave Girl until after I read Playing in the Dark. And I really appreciate the fact that Toni Morrison, as I think a lot of scholars would say, that just because a text is racist or has a variety of caricatures or is bad, we shouldn't read it. And I've taught Saphira and the Slave Girl with Toni Morrison, and students, I think, are amazed to read a bad book.
Right.
That, there's, I think, the idea of the student that because the professor is teaching it, they implicitly endorse it. It must be good. I must agree with some version of the politics of at least one of the characters in the book. And I think that reading that novel with Playing in the Dark has students like, oh my God, Toni Morrison's right, and also really fascinated with the problems of the book. And, I think that's a real joy sometimes in teaching, is being able to teach books that you don't like, or books that have real problems, and for students to sort of, like Toni Morrison, sort of fixate on them for a bit and try to sort of understand the problems of that novel. I've taught O Pioneers, I've taught My Antonia, and I love those books. I mean, they are really well written, and they're sort of really fascinating in how they handle immigrant identities and the creation of America. And so there's that sort of irony that Sapphire and the Slave Girl is also technically about that. It's interested in like what makes an America, but it is sort of an odd failure in how it can't reconcile blackness into its story.
And this idea of whiteness that she put, so I guess it's in the title of the book, right? Whiteness and the literary imagination. There's two things. It basically says, here's America, political project, cultural project, and there's literature. And Morrison, who's a writer, sort of says literature is vitally important for this idea of who Americans are. And whiteness in this book is this kind of blankness, senselessness, a certain kind of sort of stupor of not recognizing difference. This kind of, it keeps on holding on. And then she says, in almost all these books, you have these grand metaphors of whiteness. The end of the Edgar Allan Poe story, she starts with the end of some Faulkner, the end of some Saul Bellow. But that this idea of self-identity is staked on itself, self-generated. She said it is such a powerful mythology. And then I think she says, and all these authors give you all the hints to say you always need difference for that. And that difference happens to be racialized in many cases. Probably there are other instances. I'm sure someone could write a book about indigenous identity, about Latino identity, gender as a category.
Right.
But if we start with whiteness, she's actually writing a book about whiteness in America and saying, which is, so it's not, in some ways, I'm just curious, does it fit into African American studies? Because she said, I'm not adding something to African American studies. That's its own field. That's wonderful. That's great. That should exist. But she said, that's not my project here.
Yeah. I mean, I think the sort of oddity, and, you know, I want to sort of be careful how I say this, but there does seem to be, I think, an element of, at least within African American studies, and I think for African American scholars, there is this sort of this idea of, well, because I do it is African American studies or it is Black studies, that the identity of the person sort of infuses the work with the fact that it is actually, in fact, engaging with that. And obviously there are some issues with that and how that might be constructed. You know, Audre Lorde sort of famously commented on, you know, what does it mean for her to teach Jane Austen? And, you know, the idea that, you know, white teachers, white academics should, in fact, be teaching Black authors. But also the question of, like, what does it mean to actually be Black and to teach white authorship? What does it mean to teach Jane Austen? And I see that as a parallel to Toni Morrison, which is to say, as a Black woman, one of the most profound writers of the late 20th and early 21st century, to write a book, to give a series of lectures on whiteness, you know, could anyone else do that other than sort of this amazing author herself? And so I see this as like a really important text within Black studies. I do, as I said, I do teach it. I do it for my independent studies. And I think what students come away with is this recognition of a authorial blind spot as well as perhaps a blind spot the students have actually had themselves. So especially if it's a class that we've been reading sort of canonical text for a while, and then we come and read Playing in the Dark later in the semester, they're like, okay, wait, can we go back and look at Benito Cereno? Can we sort of understand that this text, which is about a slave revolt on a ship by Herman Melville, but this slave revolt is really weird. It's not how slave revolts happen, or at least not how they should look or could look. And in fact, is this interesting sort of theatrical stage that we find the formerly enslaved engaging with their enslavers. And
isn't it the book where they rebel, take over the ship, pose as running the ship,
yes,
get somebody else to help them because they're in trouble now, and then there's this kind of, are you really running the ship? And the white people who have survived this revolt have to kind of manage the ship under the control of the Black, formerly enslaved people.
Right.
So it's all about identity, loyalty, and this kind of reckoning, like who is really on whose side here. So it's not a slave revolt, like Black people revolting, white people get beaten or not.
Right. Yeah. So instead of, you know, the Amistad case or Nat Turner, where in the case of the Amistad case, you murder most of the crew but keep alive the people who can actually pilot the ship and try to go back to Africa or try to get to a safe coast. And instead, in Benito Cereno, the slave rebellion keeps a fair amount of the crew alive, but they are approached by an American ship, and so they have to put on ostensibly a play. They had to sort of pretend that their white captors are in charge and that the black individuals are still enslaved. Mm-hmm. And as readers of the 21st century who know a lot more about what slave revolts look like, especially on ships, it is completely odd and weird, and it's interesting to watch this American captain not recognize that there's been a slave revolt. And this is not how black people act, but this is not how white people act involved in the slave trade. And so I think it's a really interesting text that I think really speaks to what Morrison talks about, which is that a really smart writer like Melville can sort of point to the sort of elements in which whiteness and blackness are reflected in each other, but do a different type of work. That what black authors, the black characters in Benito Cereno, are operating under a different set of understandings and ideas than the white authors or the white captives in Benito Cereno again. And I think that this is a really interesting element that Morrison's bringing out, which is that white authors will find themselves doing something really interesting and perhaps troubling with blackness that black authors, it's not that they avoid it, it's not in view that they could do that.
Yeah. And these black characters, let's say in this Melville story, then there's Bill T. Jones, the choreographer, did this piece recently where he remembered that Pip is the cabin boy who's of African descent. We don't know, African American, presumably, in Moby Dick. And then is cast out, drifting at sea. And Bill T. Jones, actually, in this piece he did recently at the New York City in the Armory, said, I didn't remember this character for a long time, for years. There's also this interest. Morrison keeps on saying something like, we have been trained to overlook these things. So part of what I always thought maybe this is why it resonated with me when I was in college, it's kind of what we would call sort of a deconstructive reading practice. There's a little character that will unravel this entire narrative. Little in a way of, it's maybe a minor character, but this character has an incredibly important reach ultimately for what he needs to fulfill this really vital function.
Yeah.
And when you're saying sort of what these black characters do in these white texts, let's say white author texts, they're doing much more than what even the authors intended. And there I think Morrison is really just this incredibly powerful critic and very imaginative critic. She says, well, let's look at what they're doing. But who knows what Hemingway or what Willa Cather really wanted to do, what they're doing. And that's how she talks about her own writing always. She said, my characters, they just started making me do things. I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to go there. It's painful or pleasurable or joy. And I kept on thinking it's my experience. And then I realized I cannot put my experience. And there she's really great when saying American literature is full of these characters that go beyond what we call the author's intention. So she sidelines this whole project. Is Hemingway racist? I don't care. Like, I care in some ways, but I don't really care.
Yeah.
Is Willa Cather, like, writing this, is this a dumb novel? Is this a brilliant novel? It's not the point. The novel does something on its own.
Right. Yeah. And I think that we find, especially in... So I also saw the Bill T. Jones performance, and I thought it was pretty amazing in its sort of various tools of the stage. And I think it's really interesting that he did set it up as, like, do you remember Pip? He sort of this constant refrain that he sort of says to various performers on stage, like, I don't remember Pip. Do you remember Pip? And of course, Melville's Moby Dick starts off with identity, call me Ishmael. So we sort of are immediately introduced to a character, and perhaps one of the most famous lines in American literature, which is like someone self-identifying. And Pip as a character, as a young black boy on the ship, is is constantly disregarded. As is said in the piece, as is clear in the novel, Pip is brought on board one of the harpooning boats, and during various moments he jumps out of fear. And Melville, as a writer, who I really, really enjoy, and I love the ways in which he writes about vulnerability, that clearly Pip is a character who is experiencing incredible amounts of vulnerability and a lot of disregard from the mostly white crew of the ship. And the fact that what happens to Pip is that he eventually gets left at sea. He is, I think what's called turtled, is that he is able to survive by keeping his head above water in a capsized lifeboat, and he loses all language. And he is a character who gains sympathy from Ahab because of his sort of otherworldly denaturalized language. And I think that's a pretty phenomenal element of the text, is this sort of connection between a vengeful, at times villainous captain and this traumatized black boy. Even as Ahab is, has mechanized and has riled his crew on this, path of revenge towards this whale, that Pip is somehow outside of that dichotomy. I think it's really interesting. And I think it sort of speaks to the different ways that different authors think about blackness. I think blackness can be sort of this binary with whiteness, or it can sort of present itself as alterity, that there is another way in this world, that whatever mechanisms are operating within whiteness, blackness has perhaps these other mechanisms that are not necessarily oppositional, but offer some type of, offer difference.
Yeah, but can you say a little bit more about that? That's interesting. So it's not like there's white identity and black people are poised against it in some otherness or something, but Morrison kind of sketches out all these different ways, and in some ways you come away reading this short book saying there's no uniformity at all to black characters, even in white fiction.
Yeah.
They all do so many different things, both for the plot, let's say, for the construction of the novel, and they do different things as characters.
Right. And I think, I'm trying to avoid saying a good novel too much, but, I think a good novel or a good author is aware that, even in sort of classical novel criticism, it's never good enough just to sort of say, well, this character is the opposite of that character. And I think that the critical lens often engages with, this character is in fact very much like our main character, the protagonist, or is in fact, it is revelatory that, in maybe a Jungian sense, they are the shadow, which is like, this is a character that can get away with the things the main character can't do.
A shadow, in what sense? Can you say a little bit more about that?
When I think about sort of like Carl Jung's idea of the shadow, that,
No, we're really outside of academic territory.
Yeah.
Oh, Jung, like the unspeakable name in academia.
I know. I'm supposed to say Freud and Lacan.
You
leave it at that.
Stick with the canon.
Yeah.
Exactly. Those are the renegade anarchist thinkers.
Oh, I love it. But I there's something I think about Jungian thought, which I think is really helpful in terms of narrative discourses, which is that, the idea of the shadow, that there could be a character or force within a novel that is not simply one character is good, one character is evil, but the whatever the repressive structures or elements that perhaps pervade the novel need some form of outlet as well as in a novel. And, by no means do I think Toni Morrison is a Jungian, but I think there's some element that we could sort of say, like, okay, there are in fact these shadow characters that perhaps Morrison is pointing to. I think, she writes a little bit about Twain. I mean, everyone does write about Twain and everyone writes about Huck Finn. But, I think that there's a way that the relationship between Jim and Huck has become such an important part of the American canon about thinking about race, thinking about adulthood. Jim is an adult man. He has a family that is slowly revealed in a text.
Yeah.
The fact that Huck himself has a father, but that's an incredibly troubling, terrible relationship, and that Jim begins to function as a father. I mean, there's some ways in which the text is thinking, Twain is thinking about the fact that Huck needs a father, and that father figure turns into what he's able to have with Jim. But the thing that I think is interesting about that novel is that we could sort of see that relationship between the two of them. But I think we often forget, and I think some scholars, of course, do write about this, but Tom Sawyer is in that book, and Tom Sawyer remains in that book very much a child as Huck Finn has to sort of grow up. And so there are multiple instances in this text in which if we were to think about Huck Finn growing up, or if we were to think about Jim as the enslaved and being quote-unquote childlike, what we actually discover are two characters who are on a journey of incredible maturation and are confronted at the end of the text with Tom Sawyer, who has not grown at all because he hasn't been on this journey. And so there's the famous evasion at the end of Huck Finn, where Tom Sawyer wants to enact this incredibly romanticized escape narrative with Jim. And what the reader knows, what Huck knows, what Jim knows is that actually for Jim to escape is incredibly easy. He has to sort of just open a door and he can walk out. But Tom wants to enact this terrible, not in itself racist fantasy, but he wants to sort of enact the Count of Monte Cristo with Jim as the Count. And what's fascinating, and I think to bring it back to Toni Morrison, is that Jim and Huck seem very aware on a relatively good level about how American racism works. Tom does not. And so Tom's idea for Jim's escape, I think, really relies on actually Tom as a character is playing in the dark. He has this idea of what he can do with blackness, but he's incredibly wrong. He does not at all understand that Jim's life as being enslaved is incredibly vulnerable in a way that Huck has learned that and has begun to appreciate that. And so I think that's a really interesting element, either thinking about the shadow, where what I'm trying to argue is that Tom is actually the shadow to Huck, not Jim, and that the relationship between Huck and Jim is actually really complex and indebted one across sort of multiple vectors of thinking about family and partnership.
But for students, it's great to map out to say sort of that Huck has, at the end, a somewhat more sophisticated understanding, but Twain then puts in Tom sort of as if the other understanding is still totally dominant.
Yes, yeah.
Which stays in place. So even if there is some sense of becoming aware of the kind of failure of a certain kind of narrative, the other narrative is still totally powerful and there.
Right, yeah. Right, exactly. Yeah. So there's this sort of invasive parody of a narrative that begins to sort of overwhelm the text.
Sergeant and Mr. Smith, you're gonna love this house.
Bunk beds in a closet?
There's no field manual for finding the right home. But when you do, USAA Homeowners Insurance can help protect it the right way. Restrictions apply.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. We're driven by the search for better, but when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/MBO. Terms and conditions apply.
Yeah.
If you look at Mark Twain, and we have, this is 2022, and Toni Morrison wrote this in the early 90s, then the culture wars kind of started in the early 90s.
Yeah.
They actually focused at that time, in my memory, sort of with people like Jesse Helms, et cetera, on pornography and kind of federal funding, and pornography became the kind of moment for the culture wars to be ignited because contemporary art was considered pornographic.
Yeah.
Usually targeted women, people of color, and what we call today queer people, like gay people. They were sort of the target of this.
Yeah.
Today's culture wars are very different, and in some ways, Huck Finn. So Twain is sort of regarded as a complicated book by people, let's say on the left, because of the use of the N-word. Toni Morrison is on lists of legislatures to take her book, Beloved, and other books off because it has very complicated characters who suffer great violence.
Yeah.
So someone is pregnant from their father, or someone gets raped, or there's some kind of violence. So they are saying, we don't want our kids to read these things. And behind it is not to conceal sort of also, this is about race, and people should really just not, I guess, be taught anything about race.
Right. I
so
mean,
when you start with the Huckleberry Finn, like, what do you say to people? Say, like, oh, unreadable today. You know, Jim is just his caricature. I can't teach that.
Yeah. I mean, I think the overarching purposeful misreading of what critical race theory is, critical race theory sort of is always around the corner. Toni Morrison is engaged in critical race theory. And if we were to I'll just sort of say, if we were to accept critical race theory as a specifically academic and often specifically like legal construction for thinking about systems of oppression, then like a lot of the things that we sort of are finding bugbears about just like aren't in that category. But still, I think it's really interesting that sort of the branches that could perhaps lead us to critical race theory, or branches that could lead us to sort of critical engagement with race at all, would of course include Toni Morrison, and would include sort of the ever-present danger of literature is some version of truth-telling, or some version of explicating a possible reality. So the fact that you have a father rape their daughter in The Bluest Eye, the fact that Setha and Beloved commits infanticide, that various characters engage in, more technically morally reprehensible acts, in illegal acts, I think reveals that in literature, as in real life, almost anything is possible, and a lot of people live in the repercussions of those decisions and of those actions and of those experiences. And I think that Morrison is not dangerous because she's filling children with pornographic or destructive ideas or images, but the fact that these things are real and that they happen, and that those experiences have traumatic and long-lasting repercussions. And I think that we find characters in these novels by Morrison, and of course by other authors, sort of thinking about those ramifications. How does this affect not only those individuals, but those communities? And I think that those are revelations that Morrison gives us, is not simply that there are acts of violence that are terrifying and traumatic, but that communities have to sort of continue to work, continue to struggle with the fact that these things happen to them. And I think that that is the element that I think really connects Toni Morrison to overarching concepts of Black experiences, which are not simply that, Morrison is therefore representative of all Black culture or all Black literature, but the fact that she is thinking through the fact that a constructive component of authorship, and specifically Black authorship, is to think about the Black experience and what comes out of a variety of traumas and oppressions and workarounds in sort of, racism and sexism. Something that I think really connects her with Baldwin. When I think about texts like Beloved or The Bluest Eye, I'm of course also thinking about Another Country, in the ways that Baldwin is also thinking about how do, not only do children respond to adulthood, but how do adults respond to adulthood? How do they survive?
I had a conversation with Rich Blint from the New School, who teaches at the New School, about Another Country, and he said quite a lot about this idea that America needs to grow up. And both Baldwin and Morrison at different places sometimes say, Morrison says this very beautifully, she says, sometimes you can enter into the beauty of adulthood, but people don't want to do that, and they stay childlike. And for her, well, most of her books are actually centered on children's experiences or collections. For her, childlike there means a naivete about who we are, which is usually at the incredible expense of others. And Rich Blint also said in Another Country, Baldwin keeps on saying America must grow up.
Right. Yeah.
And growing up doesn't mean losing one's capacity for creation or innocence in that way, but using its ignorance, deliberate ignorance.
Right. And I think that also takes us back to thinking about Sapphira and a Slave Girl, which is that it is a text about a young enslaved Black woman and an older white woman who is experiencing the totally imaginary affair between her husband and this enslaved person. And that shows Sapphira's insecurity and her inability also to imagine a path out of that actually engages with her as a character, right? So the character cannot think of a way to engage with her husband. Instead, she thinks of a way of committing violence against an enslaved young woman. And I think it's really interesting to sort of think about that sort of impasse in the text, which is that Sapphira can't do anything. And that is, I think, marked on the fact that she experiences a disability and that she can't really walk, but that also sort of comes out that she can't think of a solution
what you're
to the
saying
problem.
Is, Morrison says this explicitly in the beginning of her book. She said, what tends to be under-interrogated and not looked at as much is the impact of racism on the oppressor.
Right.
She said, I'm not going to talk, I don't want to spend my whole time, Morrison says, thinking about white people. But actually, they're sort of off the hook, as if Sapphira's limitation, and then she uses some form of racism in a way to overcome a limitation which is not overcome at all. And Morrison said because she doesn't grow, she just uses this crutch which is available in American culture. You use racism as something to keep you from growing.
Right, yeah. She uses racist sexualized power to try to dominate Nancy. And, thinking about that, it's interesting to think about some of the work of Baldwin, if it's Giovanni's Room or Another Country, where sex and violence is always around the corner, and the ways in which characters, I think to your point about childhood, are incredibly knowing, but like to operate within the world of being naive. And so David in Giovanni's Room is a queer character, knows he's queer. People around him know he's queer, but he can't come to identify. He can't come to sort of admit to who he is. And the characters around him sort of constantly say, like, why are you making this dirty? Why are you making something loving between two individuals dirty? And I think there's something to Morrison as she's thinking about Sapphira and the Slave Girl and a few of her other texts, which suggest maybe not like, why are you making this dirty, but why are you activating, in fact, like, why are you doing the difficult thing, which is trying to make this text work when it doesn't work, when there's this other element that you could simply actualize and to use. And so, again, I'm sort of thinking about the fact that as the last novel, Sapphira and the Slave Girl doesn't use any of the sort of amazing elements that make Cather a great novelist. I think sort of the use of indirect discourse, the sort of humor of misrecognition between characters. It begins in that novel. I mean, the fact that Sapphira misrecognizes Nancy feels like Cather, but then it doesn't sort of continue into some form of recognition, or I often see Cather engaging in some version of Gothic horror or some type of characters have to deal with sort of an idea of the sublime. Right. And that just doesn't happen. I think to your point, Sapphira just sort of stays there and then unceremoniously sort of just dies off screen.
When I think about Morrison, there's a very famous quote that's on that circulates on the internet in a good way. I show it to my students a lot when she says, or maybe it's in one of her books, she says, racism is a distraction. It keeps us from doing our work. She said, I've been writing for 30 years, and then people say, oh, wow, amazing, you can write. And she says 30 years and 5 books later, and I'm supposed to start at point zero because I'm not supposed to do my work. So she said, don't engage with it. So I think this whole culture wars, these legislation, I think that is a way to distract us, actually, and to engage with it all the time. Is engaging with people who have no argument. They're making it up, this book is good, this book is bad.
Right,
If you look at Playing in the Dark, so Edgar Allan Poe, Mark Twain, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Melville, Willa Cather, Hemingway, Faulkner, and who else is she in there? Saul Bellow. You could cancel all those books because they all have very volatile, explosive things to say about race in America. If you took that canon and you thought it would be a good course on American literature, you could say this is totally unteachable, should be canceled because it gets the wrong ideas into kids' heads.
Right, yeah.
But I want to stay with this for a moment. When she's engaging with this canon, she wants to make this massive intervention and say the canon has actually been a construction of whiteness as kind of not visible to itself.
Right.
as just this neutral thing. We don't even talk about it. Like, we don't say it's the white canon. And then we had the culture wars, which were good and productive. And and it used to be this kind of, and there was an argument a couple of years ago in the Times, 2 years ago, 4 years ago, I think, I actually wrote something to those people. They did a study and said Morrison won the culture wars against Harold Bloom.
I remember that.
Yeah, it was really stupid because it was a study of syllabi and said there are more books by African-American authors than there used to be. And I wrote to them and I said, this is so against the spirit of Morrison. It is painful that you guys are calculating numbers of books written and assigned.
Yeah.
It's painful on both levels. And I said, if you're pitting two people against each other, Bloom and Morrison, at least they read literature.
Right, yeah.
Way. But I'm kind of interested in what this what she's doing with Playing in the Dark. Like, once you've taught it and once you've read it, you cannot quite go back to thinking, oh, American literature, and there's people, books by white people, books by black people, and we can sort of...
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think what is proven in whatever post-culture war, and I mean that sort of like in a postmodernist sense, which is like we're just in the next part of the culture war more than it's afterwards, which is that if anyone were to read Morrison, I think either her novels or especially reading Playing in the Dark, it would be near impossible to go back to these other texts and to sort of accept their canonicity as part of a pure white American culture. I think you sort of can't read these texts, I think, after Morrison and not sort of, in the words of Bill T. Jones, like think about Pip. I mean, like you can't.
So how did people manage to do that? I mean, and actually, I showed you this piece I'm working on Hemingway. So in The Sun Also Rises, which has two pretty extreme moments of the use of the N-word. So for our listeners, they have another Hemingway podcast, but he uses the N-word 16 times on one page. That makes it pretty hard to overlook.
Yeah.
And then in my, somewhat exhaustive survey of Hemingway criticism, it has been systematically overlooked. And even people who say, I'm going to focus on race in Hemingway, they focus on the Basque Country and the matadors, and you're thinking, wait, you're an American critic, you're writing about the American novel by the self-appointed American patriarch of American writing, and you're managing to not see this. So you're saying after Morrison, you can't not see it, but after Morrison, a lot of people still not see certain things.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where you want to sort of avoid sort of making a generational claim, but, when I read Hemingway, or read a lot of the canon, I think especially having been doing so much research on blackness in Germany, it's, seeing blackness in a lot of places where it is incredibly more evident, but then also, relatedly thinking about race, like the role of Judaism. I mean, The Sun Also Rises is thinking about the fact that there is broadly speaking, there is a upstart in the fact that there is a Jewish character who has made a rather successful living in the United States as part of this group, but is also like deeply demonized by this group. And I think it's sort of interesting to think about The Sun Also Rises as a book really thinking about race. It's thinking about gender. It's thinking about the acts of sex, since the main character cannot have penis and vagina sexual intercourse. And so there's some really interesting ways in which the novel is thinking about normalized processes of, the white heterosexual Christian man. And it's interesting to see the ways in which Hemingway actually deals with that being constantly undermined, and that characters are in fact incredibly anxious about the other. If the other is an independent woman, if it's about blackness, if it's about the role of Jewish individuals, then Hemingway's really interesting. Like when I read The Sun Also Rises, I was like really sort of struck by the sort of stereotype of Hemingway as this at once everyman, but also incredibly strong and virile and I sort of like a literary John Wayne, and then I would read Hemingway. It's like, this man is incredibly insecure and is sort of terrified by everyone around him.
What you're saying is interesting, that Hemingway, The Sun Also Rises, Conrad's Heart of Darkness, Fitzgerald's Gatsby, were read, I think, largely as existentialist books about a psychological crisis for an individual against the backdrop of all these different things. So colonialism in Heart of Darkness, in Gatsby, sort of the rise of post-war sort of materialism, etc.
Right.
The anxiety about fitting in. Gatsby's also Jewish, and we read them today like this, and I'm thinking, this is a book about anti-Semitism, about racism, about gender anxiety, about America not holding it together at all. And instead, for 50 years, the book was read as, this is American identity.
Right, yeah.
And it's interesting what you're saying, that the generational difference, and there was this shift that people felt, no, these are psychological novels, and everything else is sociology and politics, and that is just not how novels should be read.
Yeah.
And I think today we have a more capacious understanding, and Morrison says, I'm not deciding between politics and art. He's saying it doesn't quite work as art. And with Hemingway, the most devastating thing she will say about Hemingway, she says they are far more artless representations than in Edgar Allan Poe. And artless, she really wants to hit Hemingway where it'll hurt Hemingway. Not you're racist, you're ignorant, you're from Oak Park, Illinois, you don't know anything. Because you are not really as great a novelist as you think you want to be.
Right, yeah. And I think that image of Hemingway, of sort of the concise language, there's no purple prose or whatever, I think it speaks to sort of this idea of American ruggedness, this concept. I think that sort of imagines Hemingway as having perfected the sentence. I think there's a way in which Hemingway for a long time was sort of seen as having perfected a certain style of writing, and the sentence, on a sentence level structure, he had sort of nailed it. And I think the sort of apocryphal idea that he wrote the short story, Child Shoes Never Worn, which he did not write, but everyone thinks he did. And anyway, I think that there's an interesting element to the fact that Morrison sort of calls him out, or at least sort of signals that whatever art form in terms of literature that Hemingway offers us, it's not as strong or as structured within American prose as it should be.
Not as structured or as it could be.
I guess
should
could be.
Let me just to state.
Yeah.
She says, it is there, it ought to be there because it props up this fantasy of whiteness as sort of like identical to itself and having no shadow, having to do no work, actually.
Right.
And she said, but there's much more, and it's all in Hemingway. And that's why I think she keeps on saying, it's in Hemingway. I'm not inventing it. I'm not sort of thinking, oh, wow, this character may or may not be not quite white. She said, it says everything there.
Right. Yeah.
And it's kind of funny when you're taught, I was taught this book in an American high school near Philadelphia. I didn't know it was about anti-Semitism. And I've read essays. I read one essay where someone talks about Robert Cohen and calls him, the entire essay, a romantic. And they never even mention that he's Jewish. Like, it's just not mentioned in a critical essay in the 1990s. And Morrison is really light about this. She says, people have systematically managed to overlook these things. I'm not really going into this.
Yeah.
Like, she takes on the entire field of literary criticism and she says, people don't look at these things.
Yeah, and I wish I really had a response to why it took so long to see it, because it feels like, there's a sort of, at times, banal argument that, the systems and structures of racism or other forms of oppression have made it impossible for people to see this. But I wonder if there's another way to get to that to get to Toni Morrison without sort of saying it's generational, or you have to have been a Black woman author who has been writing these amazing novels for 20, 30 years by the time she gives this lecture. And I'm having a hard time sort of thinking of another answer. And I'm not trying to Occam's razor would say, then, Toni Morrison, it's generational. But I wonder.
I think it's like a paradigm shift kind of thing. We're talking about sort of Morrison changes something. She has a stature, she has the authority, she has the knowledge, she's a writer. But I think what you're saying maybe also, there had always been other voices. They just were not quite foregrounded.
Yeah.
And people had always said, really, this book is about a new woman? I mean, and people just were left out in a way.
Yeah.
It's sort of, I interviewed Joan Scott once, the historian, who has this very famous essay called Gender as a Critical Category, a useful category for critical analysis in history. Right. And she says gender must be applied all the time, not just when we're looking at women or gender relationships. All the time, it's useful. In a way, what you're saying, is it a generational thing and people didn't see it before? Maybe they saw it. Maybe they had different tools to articulate it.
Yeah.
And there are moments, and you can find these moments. There are moments of reviews or Hemingway in his letters with his editors or something. He's working things out all the time.
Right.
I mean, The Battler, one of his famous stories, the Negado stories, which are very hard to read today, for me actually.
Yeah.
I changed the Wikipedia entry the other day because The Battler, one of the characters, was in the Wikipedia entry referred to by the N-word. Without quotation marks.
Just there.
This is 2022.
Yeah.
So I'm going to think Hemingway people are still producing it, and they actually think, well, that's Hemingway's language.
Yeah.
So in some ways, your question is really good to say, okay, does it take the genius of Morrison?
Yeah.
Or in generational kind of means it's a fad, it'll go away again, there'll be another generation after that. But it's...
Yeah. It actually, so what having this conversation is making me think about some current research I'm doing, which I think is really pertinent to think about Playing in the Dark, which is that I've been doing some research around Eugene O'Neill's play Emperor Jones, which is a short play.
What year is this about?
1920.
20s, okay.
Is it 1920? It's 1919, 1920. I'm sure both those years are actually wrong. I'm probably like 1917. But anyway, it's a short play about a Black American man who has usurped power on an unnamed island Black nation, and basically the indigenous people of the island rise up to kill him. But it's really about a sort of psychological profile as Brutus Jones, the emperor, sort of begins to wander through the jungle and has these visions of his past and what has sort of led him to sort of take over this island nation. It's really fascinating. I think probably many people would find it inflammatory at this point, but it's a really fascinating, and it was really uplifted by the Black community in the 1920s as sort of an example of a white author giving a Black character played by Black actors some pathos that was sort of outside of the minstrel tradition. And it famously, the second actor to play Emperor Jones was Paul Robeson, and it was seen as sort of the launching pad for Paul Robeson's career. But what I wanted to talk about is sort of the interesting behind-the-scenes production usurpations that happened, I think, presage some of the things we might see in Morrison, thinking about the African presence within white literature, which is that the first actor to play Emperor Jones was Charles Gilpin, a famous, one of the most well-renowned Black actors of the early 20th century. And O'Neill's play uses the N-word a lot. And as Gilpin played the role on stage, he kept not saying it, and he purposely dropped it out, continued to sort of change the role to sort of fit what he thought Blackness was. And so he was like...
1920, not 2020.
Yeah. And this Black character was like, I'm not saying the N-word. I don't know if he said Negro or something else, but it was a really interesting element to the production of this play that on one level we can see this sort of quote-unquote progressive elements of a white playwright not using the minstrel, creating a different idea of Blackness, and as Black theater critics talked about, like a serious role instead of a comedic role. But then we have this sort of interesting, almost ironic, trickster-like element in Gilpin undermining the sort of seriousness of this play by not playing by the rules and sort of changing the rules. And I'm seeing this as like very similar on a performance level to what Morrison talks about in recognizing what Black characters are doing in white authored work. That Charles Gilpin is enacting, I know what this play is actually doing, and I'm not going to go through this. I'm going to point out how race is actually operating in this by not saying the most obvious word to sort of mark the race in the play. So I think that perhaps thinking about previous generations, we can see elements of, not the form of the lecture or the book in which Morrison's making very explicit these claims, but perhaps there are these enactments and embodiments of various actors, dancers, performers, lecturers in which they are not playing by the rules. They're actually calling out those structures of, this is the white canon, this is white constructions of race. is anyone else noticing how race is actually operating here?
I think our colleague Deb Willis has given some lectures on Gone with the Wind and Hattie McDaniel, what she does to that role.
Yeah.
So you're saying kind of from within that space, and I think this is the gist of Playing in the Dark as an academic, I say, from within the space of so-called white culture, which Morrison wouldn't accept as a term at all.
Right, yeah.
Let's say American cultural production. There are moments of both pointing out the sort of shortcomings of this construction,
right,
and not even to sort of criticize or oppose it, to sort of say, I can just make this apparent. And I think that's the strength of Morrison, and what you're saying about this actor doing this. I can make apparent to you what doesn't really work here, and I'll leave it up to you to work this out.
Right.
Not I'm going to correct it and give you the correct version, because this is also, there's no correct version.
Right.
Like, I think I would assume in this play, like it's a staged adaptation with an actor, and then Paul Robeson, I don't know what he did in that play, but then it goes through his iterations. Is it still performed today, this kind of play?
It was performed, I think, a few years ago, but it is still definitely performed, and it does hold a sort of interesting place in theater as sort of being, I think at times sort of misrepresented as sort of the very first time, like, serious black acting happened. I think it's the first time in which a quote-unquote serious drama of the 20th century within modernism sort of plays the black. I mean, you sort of like the caveats have to sort of be added.
Theater and modernism,
right? Yeah,
right. Because we have 100 years before, actually.
Right. Yeah.
I think on Bleecker and Mercer Street we had the first African theater.
Right. Yeah.
Which was shut down by an Irish mob of youngsters or something like that.
Yeah. The history of Ira Aldridge and the creation of the African Grove Theater.
The African Grove Theater, which is right around the corner here.
Yeah. But the interesting thing, and I won't stay on it too much, is like the African Grove Theater kept changing places, partially because of, racist mobs and stuff like that. But I think it also speaks to sort of that element of adaptation and hybridity, that it wasn't simply like, oh, burned down, it doesn't exist. It's like actually it was movable. It could actually sort of survive.
So it's not a tragic story. This is the end of that moment,
right.
1820s, and then we're done. It's like actually there's a tradition. But what I'm saying is that what we get from Morrison and these examples you're giving about O'Neill play, and the actor's name is
Charles Gilpin.
That there's a kind of deeper tradition. I think the Morrison in this kind of very powerful and gracious way says, this is a deeper reading of America. And here I'm done.
Yeah.
Mic drop.
Yeah.
And she kind of says, this is a deeper reading. And in some ways, if you don't want to read this, she basically, this is Morrison's gesture. And I met her 3 or 4 times, and she had this gesture, and she said, if you don't accept this is not my problem. Like, this is deeper, and that's it.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a way in which I've heard similar stories of sort of not foreclosing conversation, but what do you want me to do if you don't want to have the conversation I'm having?
Saying this is the evidence, this is my reading. You can quarrel with it or don't, but if you don't, then that's your choice.
Right, yeah.
And she's not convinced by not quarreling, which is falling again into kind of embarrassed silence, all these evasions, which American culture is really good at.
Right, yeah.
And I think partly why I keep on asking about this sort of where are we in today's culture, because Morrison doesn't leave a person like me, like a white person, a space to say, oh, it's awkward, or I have no authority to talk about it, or I don't know anything, or I couldn't teach an African-American book, or I don't know from race.
Yeah.
Because she said, well, isn't that the easiest way out? To both claim you want to do good, but, I'm inhibited by you people. For her, this, I think, produces this kind of... It's not frustration or exasperation at all. She's just indifferent.
Right.
It's just like, okay, you don't want to talk about it. I know you don't want to. You have never talked about it.
Right.
So you keep not talking about it and making all sorts of excuses for yourself, because that is your whole project.
Right, yeah.
That's what she says whiteness is, making all these excuses, explanations, rationalizations for not doing the work.
Yeah, and I think, it is ironically sort of within literature, then of course that's the political project, which is like, when are you going to deal with any element of history? When does this get not even resolved but acknowledged? And I think we constantly see in the 2020s a real disregard, I would say just a disregard for history, and I think almost a disregard for culture in sort of the elements of, I was looking at this one right-wing pundit sort of saying, didn't we figure out sexism and racism in the 20th century? And I was like, I wish we had. And
I think our experience is really, when we hear something like that,
yeah,
our experience is very different because teaching in a university makes you realize we haven't worked out anything. And that's a good thing in a certain way. Because also if I thought, we worked it out and I'm going to give the lesson plan to this next generation, I don't quite think we have under any illusion we've worked everything out. So in some ways when you're teaching, you realize nothing has really been worked out. And not that we then problematize and puzzle everything up to to infinity. We say no, actually there's still huge moral questions, political questions, questions of coexistence that we have yet to work out.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important part. I think the idea of figuring out moral questions can often feel settled because I think people often sit in their morality. Morality isn't something that they are actively engaging in unless there's a dilemma in front of them. And I think sort of being able to say there are not even specifics of morality, but sort of where do the big moral claims we hold true, where do they lead us? So if we, if it's facetious or not, if we all agree racism is bad, that doesn't mean we have all agreed upon reparations. It does not mean we've all agreed upon certain cultural norms or cultural experiences, but in fact, reveal these deep fissures about what happens next when it comes to those types of moral claims. And of course, there are people who think absolutely they know the solution and it's right and that everyone should follow what they're doing. And of course, there are people who are, again, being absolutely facetious in what they think the solutions are. But I think that back to Morrison, I think that what she does is, and you said it was a mic drop, and I agree that sort of this, these lectures really open up the some element of the core of American literature or American culture. I think you're right to sort of point out Morrison's not too does not get tripped up about concepts of whiteness as much as that she's focused on where do we find different types of valuations around race and how is race operated and used. And I think that that's actually incredibly helpful outside of the novel, but is also, I think, inherent to sort of thinking about the American novel, which is why does this black character act like an automaton? Why does this black character create so much fear even though they haven't done anything? I taught last year Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar, and I forget every single time there's a black nurse in that novel who appears near the very end when she's in the psychiatric ward. And
can't pretend that everybody.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm gonna get it wrong how she describes him, but she basically describes him as sort of this almost as a minstrel figure. He's sort of this big-lipped, smiling, big-eyed character, and you're sort of surprised in this, classic, taken on as feminist text, that there's this sort of really disturbing image of a black man. But it also, of course, appears after she's had sex for the first time. And so there's something really interesting about this white American daughter of a German immigrant character who's had this pretty traumatic experience of sex, and she is soon finds herself being watched by a black man. And so I think there's something I haven't figured out, but I think there's something returning to Playing in the Dark. I would be sort of interested to spend more time with it. That's what I think
Morrison gives you a kind of a way to start thinking about it, because she maps these kind of rhetorical moves what people do, what characters are. They're not stereotypes, but they're actually they're much more than stereotypes. They are maybe archetypes. And that's what I found really useful when I was working on Hemingway, working on Fitzgerald. And Fitzgerald, famous scene, the yellow limousine with three African Americans, passes them on the Queensboro Bridge and goes into Manhattan first. And I think that's the end of that novel, and that's the beginning of the New America. It's they actually pass them. But Morrison gives us a way to see these things which have been deliberately not seen. So in some ways, in Sylvia Plath, you can now say, what do I do with this?
Right, yeah.
Rather than, I'm scandalized. Oh my God, this is awkward and bad.
Right.
Morrison says, well, no, actually, its badness is either a failure on the narrative level, and that's important, or its badness serves a real purpose here, rather than sort of, I can't handle this.
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting in my experience that I will sort of point out something, like, I'll be honest, it's an incredibly minor part of Plath's novel. I think it's 2 pages, but like it's something to stumble over. Yeah.
Put it like that.
It feels like, I think maybe Morrison would agree with this. If you were like running around at the track and all of a sudden on your third round there was a tree log in the middle, you would still wonder, like, wait, why is there a tree log here?
Yeah.
And even if it's gone by the time you're doing your 4th lap, you would still, in your mind, you'd be like, why was there a tree log all of a sudden?
Right.
And who put it there? Why was it there? And why was it a difficulty? And also, am I going to try to put it out of my mind?
Right.
And I think that that's sort of what Morrison gets at.
The work that's necessary to keep it out of our mind.
Yeah.
Which sort of, and Morrison probably says it's like a little bit of a splinter. It stays there.
Right.
Or a mote or something like that in your eye. It stays there. We
Right.
pretend it's not. And that's the great pretense in America. Like, oh, we can overlook these things.
Right. Which is sort of interesting to think about the mote in the eye, which is that that's a part of Sula is when she catches her friend having an affair with her husband, is that all of a sudden there's this literal spot in her eye where she just can't see something.
Oh, right.
And I don't know if Morrison's thinking back to her own novel, but I think it is this interesting element, which is like when something proves a problem, what perhaps on a subconscious level do you do to not recognize that there's a problem?
Yeah. Well, Paul, I want to thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
We should have another conversation on Sula or Bluest Eye or any of the Morrison novels. So, this was a conversation with Paul Edwards, who is now assistant professor of English and dramatic literature at New York University, my colleague. Yeah, it's really great to see you in person.
Great seeing you. Thank you.
And for the listeners, I also want to point out the podcast is hosted at the newbooksnetwork.com, which is really awesome. So if you find it there, that's really great, which is a review site for academic and other titles. A very powerful kind of place for us. I'm very happy that they're hosting us. And you can find also information at thinkaboutit.podcast on Instagram, uli.bear on Instagram, or at ulibear on Twitter. And I post all the new episodes. And on a website that is linked to all these Instagram pages, especially at thinkaboutit.podcast, I'll put notes about you, Paul, your publications, some notes on Playing in the Dark. So people who want to do further reading, they can get all that information on my social media and web presence.
Wonderful. I'm sure I'll send you an email with all the corrections for page numbers of everything I said.
No, I really value and appreciate this conversation, and it's really, it's especially fun and exciting to talk to someone who's as committed to teaching and, changing in a way what we think the canon holds. I think there's much more to discover.
Oh, well, thank you, and I look forward to coming back sometime.
Thanks.
Yeah.